The Liberation Collection is the brainchild and the gift of Sir Charles Chadwyck-Healey, who I'm delighted is with us this evening. The collection brings together thousands of books and pamphlets in French on the subjects of the Second World War, the occupation and the liberation, published during a period stretching from the liberation of Paris in August 1944 to the end of 1946. The collection, to which Sir Charles continues to make occasional additions to this day, provides a unique opportunity to survey the state of book publishing and printing in France at a time when the country was just beginning its long recovery from the war. It also contains absolutely jaw-dropping provenance among the specific copies that Charles and his team have tracked down. The purpose of this amazing gift has, of course, always been not for us simply to have it, but for it to be used, whether as a bibliographical tool through the highly detailed records for its contents in our catalogue, or as a resource for in-depth research. It has been the subject of a major exhibition curated by Sir Charles, held here in the University Library and then in the Grolier Club. It has been the inspiration for 5 liberation lectures, also generously funded, concluding with Professor Rory Finnan's talk about the Ukrainian experience of the Russian war in 2022. It is currently the subject of a PhD undertaken by Sophie, who's with us this evening, co-supervised by the University Library and the Open University. And this year it has been the focus of the Liberation Visiting Scholarship Scheme, sponsored generously by the Penchant Foundation, which culminates in this evening's event. I would like to thank Sir Charles and the Penchant Foundation for their generosity. And would also like to take the opportunity to thank colleagues in the University Library, especially in the UL Research Institute, and our French specialist, Irène Fabry-Théranger, among many others, for their help with supporting the scholarship and with today's event. We were incredibly lucky to have attracted as our Liberation Visiting Scholar, Dr. Marie Puren. Dr. Puren is Associate Professor in History and Digital Humanities at EPITA, an engineering school in computer intelligence based in Paris. And she has brought a really exciting new digital humanities approach to the collection. Her work on the collection not only helps to bring in more and more attention to the Liberation Collection itself, but also provides inspiration for approaches to other collections too. And so rather than cut into further time, I'll hand over to Marie. Thank you.
My notes.
Oh, that's your notes. Fair enough, I'll just take mine. So sorry.
So thank you so much for this presentation. So good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for attending this talk. I am delighted to present the preliminary results of my work on the Liberation Collection, which I had the opportunity to study for 2 months in June and July, thanks to the support of Sir Charles Chadwyck-Healey and the Penchant Foundation and the Cambridge University Library. So this scholarship has allowed me to continue research I have been engaged in for several years on the relationships between literature, publishing, and politics during wartime. I have first focused extensively on French publishing during the 4 years of German occupation in France. The study of the Liberation Collection now allows me to expand this research by examining the direct repercussions of its war years on French literature and publishing in the aftermath of the World War II. And so it is by drawing on this collection that I want to revisit the reconstruction of French consciousness through resistance literature from the perspective of literary history, publishing history, and also political history. My work is both historical and methodological. The first involves reassessing the foundational narrative conveyed by fictions and personal narratives published just after the war. I'm analyzing the shifting portrayal of the enemy, as well as the strategies of narrative simplification and edification, along with the influence that political discourse may have had on these narratives. I also wish to examine the reasons for the decline of resistance literature as early as 1946, and I'm seeking to more precisely identify the questioning of the sacred narrative of the resistance. From a methodological perspective, I use the method offered by Digital Humanities to study this corpus of text. I distinguished three main aspects: creating a digital corpus, integrating this new corpus into the university library's digital collections, and analyzing this data using quantitative and computational methods. So during this presentation, I will briefly, but very briefly, introducing the Chadwyck-Healey Liberation Collection. I then hope to give you a good overview of literature and publishing in France at the Liberation. I will conclude with a contribution of digital humanities to the study of the collection, and I will discuss the next steps of my work. So let me hand the floor to Douglas W. Alden, who in 1947 traveled to Paris to assess the state of French literary life. A few weeks after the liberation of Paris, I left Croydon in the fog and flew over unending cloud banks in the direction of France. Once in Paris, I looked for familiar scenes and faces, most of them too were intact. What of the intellectual life of France? Had it as well. My reformed friends told me not to meet Jean Anouilh and Jean-Paul Sartre Wicklow. Wearing my warmest uniform, I went to this place and was reassured. But my duties with OSS soon recalled me to London, and I continued to see France only infrequently through breaks in the clouds. In attempting to survey French literature since the liberation, I find myself above the same cloud bank because I have had as much difficulty as anyone assembling my documentation. I shall therefore be able to describe only what I have seen through the breaks in the clouds, occasionally a red-tide oasis and sometimes a promised land. This text reflects a France that, much like its physical landscape, is slowly recovering from the material and psychological destruction caused by the conflict. There is palpable uncertainty in this questioning. Did French intellectual life also survive the war? Or whether the author notes that his perspective on this literature is partial, fragmented, much like the banks of clouds that obscure its full vision. He can only glimpse clearings, like certain works or figures emerging from the chaos. Douglas W. Alden had already understood that post-war French literature is both a space of continuity and rupture. It reconnects with certain values while being profoundly transformed by the traumas of the war. And like Douglas W. Alden, I also want to better understand the exact impact of the liberation on literature, as well as on publishing in France. However, unlike Alden, who has had as much difficulty as anyone assembling his documentation, I am fortunate enough to have at my disposal an exceptional collection to help me answer this question. So the Chadwyck-Healey Liberation Collection is a unique collection of more than 3,000 works published in France in the immediate post-war period following the liberation of Paris in August 1944. And this collection was assembled by Sir Chadwyck-Healey and donated to the University Library, so you know that already. So the aim of Sir Chadwyck-Healey in creating this collection was to collect everything published in French, primarily in France, on the subject of the Second World War, the occupation and the liberation. The starting date is the liberation of Paris, and the end of 1946 is the cutoff date. I completely agree with Sir Charles Chadwyck-Healey when he said that the days, weeks, and months following the liberation were an extraordinary period for the French people, illustrating the cataclysmic impact of the occupation and the liberation on the nation. In 1944, the French literary and publishing landscape was not a field of ruins. As Douglas W. Alden understood, it was undergoing a full reinvention. For literary life did not come to a halt in 1940. On the contrary, many either collaborated or published books clandestinely, risking their freedom and sometimes paying with their lives. As early as 1944, even before the liberation of the territory, the Comité National des Écrivains, the National Writers' Committee, or CNE, the main organ of literary resistance created in 1941, called for a purge of the literary world. Compiling blacklist of writers who were compromised with the Nazis. In fact, the purge began during the war itself, becoming a central issue in the political rivalries stemming from the resistance. The fall of 1944 marked its most intense phase, but a resurgence of tension was observed in April 1945 with the return of deportees. Calm followed in 1946, and the French amnesty laws of 1947 and 1953 brought the process to an end. The CNE, so the National Writers' Committee, assigned itself two essential tasks: purging the literary world and honoring the memory of writers who died during the war. A complete reversal took place, not only in the discourses circulated in the public sphere, but also within the intellectual community. Underground clandestine writers and celebrated authors switched their respective positions. After World War II, resistance literature dominates the French book market. There was indeed a significant demand in France for literature centered on the resistance movement. French readers were eager to read works written by authors involved in the resistance, particularly those that depicted the struggles and experiences of the wartime period. The intertwining of politics and literature also became the defining feature of the post-war period. Intellectuals were compelled to engage with political ideologies, and literature evolved into a powerful tool for promoting the values and ideals upheld by the resistance. Books turned into a political issue. They are seen as a powerful medium to reshape the national consciousness badly damaged by the occupation and the war years. This era also saw the emergence of numerous and new publishing houses, which capitalized on the literary resurgence of the liberation. These new publishers competed with more established houses that were sometimes accused of collaboration with the occupiers during the war. With the German occupation in 1940, publishers were forced to take refuge in the Free Zone. While most of them returned to their Parisian offices once the occupation began, some remained in the Free Zone, notably because they were Jewish. This was the case for the Ferenczi family, or Léon Pierrequin of the Cra publishing house, which would later become the Édition du Sagittaire. The occupation thus provided the opportunity to redraw, for the first time, the map of publishing in France, without, however, really challenging Paris' centrality. The liberation also marked a new reconfiguration of the publishing landscape in France. We can first see that a little over 40% of the works in the Liberation Collection were not published in Paris. If we take a closer look at the metadata of the collection, we notice that some publishing houses are located abroad, sometimes across the Atlantic, in Switzerland, for example. During the war, these publishing houses released texts that were banned in occupied France. The liberation was also marked by a proliferation of many small publishing houses scattered across the country. Many historical and established publishing houses did not fully recover from the war years. Some were accused of collaboration and purged. Others were economically weakened by the war and couldn't bounce back. And some lost their leaders during the conflict. This proliferation of publishing houses outside of Paris goes hand in hand with a climate of newfound freedom that swept through the media. The press is a good example of this situation. In publishing, the movement was less pronounced, but alongside a few houses born from clandestinity, small literary publishers full of ambition appeared. 1945 saw the emergence of new publishing houses in Paris, such as Julliard, the Édition du Seuil, La Table Ronde, Robert Laffont. I know you know them. And of course, les Éditions de Minuit, directly born out of resistance and which hold a unique place in the French publishing landscape during the war and the post-war years. The intellectual context was conducive to the development of these new publishing houses. But their life would not be easy. In the post-war publishing world, young publishing houses faced significant challenges as they struggled to compete with the dominance of well-established publishers. These larger companies had the advantage of resources and strong brand recognition, making it difficult for newcomers to gain traction. Many of these new publishers lacked the financial backing and infrastructure to compete effectively. As a result, many of the new publishing houses that sprang up in the aftermath of the war were quickly disappeared, unable to overcome the tough realities of the publishing industry. At the time, the entire literary and publishing world was deeply impacted by the issues surrounding the resistance. The literary scene was reshaped by the banishments, proscriptions, and the spotlight on intellectuals who refused to compromise during the war. Authors from the resistance, as well as works composed in clandestinity, experienced great success. Bookstores were selling numerous accounts of the Maquis, novels celebrating the resistance, as well as works advocating for the purge. It is therefore no surprise that the first writers to speak about the war were those who had actively opposed the Germans through their actions, their writing, or even more modestly, through their silence. Many of them achieved considerable critical and public success, which likely reflected a societal desire to relive and publicly process highly traumatic events. As Jean-Paul Sartre noted in 1948, toute guerre est un manichéisme. Every war is a manichaeism. These novels, largely written or conceived during the conflict, clearly embodied this mindset. The German occupiers, often depicted as a group to strip them of individuality, were frequently compared to animals, representing the enemy to be fought and driven away. While collaboration was not absent from these novels, it was depicted as purely opportunistic, never really ideological. The line between them and us was largely impermeable. So writers associated with resistance achieved considerable critical and public success. Let's just mention, it is not exhaustive. Mon village et l'heure allemande by Jean-Louis Bory, Éducation européenne by Romain Gary, Le son des autres by Simone de Beauvoir, Les forêts de la nuit by Jean-Louis Curtis, and the trilogy Chemin à la liberté by Jean-Paul Sartre. All these novels were resounding commercial successes. This success must also be understood within a particular context for French literature. The assertion that politics and literature always go hand in hand. Indeed, it was the era of committed literature engagée. The period of the liberation and the early post-war years cannot be fully grasped without acknowledging this aspect. In the history of ideas in France, the year 1944-1945 are quite particular. Writers, journalists, and politicians were given the essential task of making sense of one of the most deeply traumatic events of the contemporary period. The promotion of resistance literature, written by resistance rather than traditional authors, so by actors rather than authors, was marked by a redefinition of literary values, notably through the clandestine publication that had helped preserve the French spirit during the occupation. The post-war period was also marked by a transformation of the literary landscape, with far-right writers being marginalized and resistance writers gaining prominence. By claiming the legacy of the resistance, the writers of 1945 set themselves the mission of preserving the particular worldview and spirit of the shadow fighters. In addition to explicitly or implicitly responding to a typical collaborationist discourse, post-war works take up what had been said clandestinely during the occupation. And according to their authors, the texts that had been published between 1940 and 1944 defended humanist values that, beyond the political and aesthetic opposition of the pre-war period, were supposed to redefine French literature and culture, naturally opposed to the far right in general and Nazism in particular. So the French historian Gisèle Sapiro notes that the struggle for the legitimate definition of a French spirit or French folk would become the more or less explicit rallying cry that would unite in the same fight writers who were very different from each other, from proponents of art for art's sake to communist writers, including dissident Catholic poets and intellectuals. One of the functions of culture in the resistance, and especially in resistance literature, was indeed to mask significant political differences. It was clear that after the division of the 30s, the French, at least a part of them, could only unite around culture. Hence, the primary role of literature as a point of convergence. An external principle remained decisive: the political situation. The pressure exerted by politics and culture manifests in various ways, either by imposing a form of engagement on the intellectual or by guiding their choices. In this context, certain positions, whether communist, Catholic, Gaullist, predominated and were politically legitimized by the resistance. Les Lettres françaises is a striking example of its relationship between politics and culture. As its director, Claude Morgan, pointed out in an article in December 1945, Lettres françaises is not just a literary journal. It is at the same time, as we have proclaimed since day one, a political journal. For literature can in no way be separated from politics, just as a writer cannot be indifferent to the fate of humanity. This statement clearly illustrates how at that time literature and politics were intrinsically linked, with each writer implicitly confronted by the need to take a stand. In the very first page of the first legal issue of Les Lettres françaises, published in September 1944, Jean-Paul Sartre already illustrated this idea in the new Manifesto of French Writers. There, he celebrates what he calls the Republic of Silence, recalling that, under the German occupation, writing could become a heroic act. Since an all-powerful police force sought to reduce us to silence, every word became precious, like a declaration of principle. The theory of committed literature, or littérature engagée, posits that the writer must actively participate in the social world to which they belong. Consequently, they bear the responsibility of intervening through their works in the debates of their time. This approach reflects the tension between the autonomy of literary creation and the writer's engagement in the social struggles of their era. From the presentation of Les Temps modernes in 1945 to What is Literature in 1948 by Jean-Paul Sartre, the proponents of committed literature attempt to meet this dual challenge, making literature a tool for action while preserving its intrinsic value. The concept of the Republic of Silence also referred to a time when, in secrecy and under threat, words carried the weight of resistance. However, with the liberation, the challenge of committed literature becomes preserving the weight and significance of every word, no permitted and free of risk, as though it were still a declaration of principle. And indeed, the theory of committed literature posits that the writer must actively participate in the social world to which they belong. The liberation of a country restores to writers the right and the power to participate in public debate. And the period immediately following the liberation is characterized, to use Gisèle Sapiro's expression, by an over-politicization of literary issues. The post-war period is thus marked by a strong intertwining of politics and literature, with the resistance greatly influencing literary narratives. Books played a key role in redefining the collective memory of a conflict, especially in reconstructing the national consciousness. The over-politicization of literature after liberation can be seen in how resistance writers took a role in public debate, considering literature a tool in the service of national reconstruction. Writers emerging from the resistance assume or are assigned a role in the reconstruction of what is commonly referred to a national consciousness. Resistance literature was also perceived as a rallying point, masking major political differences between the writers. Culture became a common denominator, with literature playing a central role in bringing together the French people around humanist values. The liberation marks the emergence of what Sartre calls a nationalization of literature, where books become powerful tools for disseminating an ideology and rebuilding national consciousness. This dominance was short-lived as traditional literary institutions regained control. While the experience of the war left a lasting mark on the issues specific to the literary field, and while it contributed to the transformation of the literary landscape, the reign of enterprises born from resistance was short-lived. Between 1945 and 1947, a shift in the balance of power occurred in favor of traditional literary institution, and as early as 1946, the publishing industry recorded a decline in interest in resistance literature. Publishing houses like les Éditions de Minuit faced economic difficulties. The symbolic weight of the resistance began to erode, and the political and human utopia that had been hoped for gave way to capitalist logic. After the lyrical illusion of liberation came the time of disillusionment. And after 1948, political engagement in literature saw a decline, marking a shift in the literary field. In 1954, in her novel Les Mandarins, Simone de Beauvoir took a particularly critical view of this period. She wrote, "When you reread what you wrote in 44-45, you feel like laughing." In the aftermath of the war, there is no doubt that the resistentialist novels contributed to crystallizing the memory of the resistance into a founding narrative dedicated to rebuild this national consciousness. This is where the main part of the memorial commitment of resistance writers lies, in terms of ideas and politics. To offer the public, after the fact, a coherent version of the war, in which not only the French, but also France itself are portrayed as the heroic benefactors. The resistance was, and still remains, a sacred narrative, often simplified and embellished. It is through this founding narrative that national identity, fractures in the aftermath of the war, was able to be rebuilt. Literature published during the liberation fulfilled the three major tasks that representation of World War II were expected to accomplish at the time, namely, to provide a comprehensive and coherent picture of a conflict to a disoriented population, to discredit a particular type of ideology and discourse, identified as those of the occupiers and the collaborators, to contribute to the development and dissemination of a collective memory of the war, likely to benefit one or another of the groups aspiring to rebuild and lead French society. Desires for moralism, simplification, exemplification, and didacticism are those at play in post-war literature. In this context, there are not signs of the intelligentsia's inability to produce true or good literature, but rather the sine qua non condition for this intelligentsia to recognize the literary value of works published at the time of the liberation. Research examining the literature of this period primarily focused on literary aspects, while some analyze the condition under which this literature is produced. I explore this question by focusing on the texts themselves, while also considering the broader political and editorial context in which they are created. Instead of limiting my analysis to a few selected works, I work with a large corpus of representative texts, ensuring that popular literature, often overlooked by contemporary studies of this period, is not neglected. At the beginning of this work, I intended to focus solely on fiction. Indeed, fiction is a particularly relevant medium for accessing the collective imagination of the French. However, upon examining the collection, I was led to include personal narratives in my corpus of study. This kind of representation of the war, both during and after the conflict, played a significant role in shaping the collective memory. They thus played a crucial role in the complete reshaping of the intellectual landscape at the liberation. Fictions and personal narratives are quite well represented in the Liberation Collection. And these works make up just under a third of the collection, nearly 1,000 books. One of the major strengths of the Liberation Collection is its focus on popular literature. It notably includes a collection of children's fiction. For instance, the completeness of the Jeunesse Héroïque series provides a good insight into how resistance narratives were conveyed to children. This is not the first time in France that children have been addressed during a conflict. The 4 years of the First World War saw the publication of literature directly aimed at them. The goal at the time was to mobilize this population, which could not be sent to a battlefield, but whose role was considered crucial. The idea was that if children did not falter, if they believed in their country's ultimate victory, their fathers and mothers would not falter either, and would also offer their support for the war effort. This is one aspect of the collection that particularly interests me because while literary propaganda aimed at children during the First World War has been extensively studied, it has been much less examined for the period of World War II and especially for the liberation period. 3 main characteristics can be distinguished in this literature intended for younger audiences. First, it has a didactic, almost pedagogical purpose. It also contributes to the representation of a mythologized resistance, emphasizing the heroism of this character. And finally, a significant portion of this text features scenes of great violence. So, unsurprisingly, it is a didactic literature. The goal is to teach children about history of the present. I mentioned, no, I didn't mention. It is kind of a history in the making, in French, histoire en chantier. And it seems to me that juvenile fiction serves as a striking testament to it. There are certain key dates and events that children must learn and remember. And it is a role of fictions intended for them to teach them this history and thus shape the memory of the war for younger generation. There are also numerous depictions of the Maquis and more broadly of the people taking up arms against an army far better equipped than they are. Here we find all the classic tropes of popular resistance and guerrilla. The people rising up on barricades, hiding in the Maquis, and spontaneously revolting and defending themselves. Children's fiction glorifies individual violent action. One must fight the occupier with whatever means are available: bare hands, homemade bombs, grenades, pistols. In other words, the characters make do with whatever they have at hand, particularly in what can be described as a form of urban guerrilla warfare. While this literature for young readers glorifies individual sacrifice and honors those who die in action, it is also a literature that does not spare readers from extremely violent descriptions, including scenes of torture. To illustrate this, I have selected 2 books and 3 excerpts that I believe provide a good representation of what young readers might have been exposed to. In this third excerpt, young resistance fighters who are about the same age as some of the readers are whipped by militia members. Blood ran down the skin in increasingly thick streams. The executioners regularly let out grunts of efforts. All 6 of them were now being tortured together. The belts whistled through the air and landed with a thud. The second example is a book that particularly struck me. It is a very young woman who, after being arrested by the French police, falls into the hands of the Gestapo. The head is tied to a wooden chair, handcuffed behind her back. 2 SS officers had already bloodied her face. They were now hitting her with a bullwhip until she passed out from the pain. They tore off her clothes and plunged her into ice cold water. A German held her head under the water until she could no longer breathe. Bleuette thought she was dying, but at the last moment, the doctor who was taking her pulse pulled her out by the hair. I find this issue of violence to be truly central in this literature for young readers. I still need to study it in more detail, but I already have a number of hypotheses. Is it a matter of transposing and exorcising the violence experienced during the occupation for children? Is it about mobilizing children to help their parents better accept the new political order being established? Another important aspect is that these texts were published around 1948. In other words, at a time when interest in this literature was significantly declining. Is it then a form of voyeurism? In other words, are these particularly violent events described in detail because it sells? Or is it because this was the moment when all the atrocities committed during the occupation were being discovered, and these books were helping children understand and process them by heroizing those who suffered through them? To answer this question, it is necessary to place the literature back into the highly political context in which it is also situated. Because even if this is not considered great literature, these texts are also influenced by the political ideas of the time. In the first text I quoted, one can also read the following passage. Pierre, a hidden witness to the scene, watches his compatriots torturing his comrades in arms. The others were still there, reveling in the sight of blood. Pierre saw their eyes, like beasts in heat. Fascism had turned them into monsters. Ultimately, this sentence gives an entirely different significance to the terrible scene unfolding before our eyes. Fascism had turned them into monsters. The French militiamen who torture young resistance fighters are acting under the influence of a political doctrine that has profoundly changed them. The condemnation is clear. They must be punished. But the fight must not be solely internal. Above all, the struggle must be against fascism, which is the root cause of the fracture in the French spirits. Let's now move on to the methodological aspect of my research. How can computers be used to answer all these historical questions? To analyze this large corpus of text, I have chosen to rely on methods from the digital humanities. In other words, I will not only read this text with my own eyes, but also using a computer. This involves adopting a dual methodological approach. On the one hand, the traditional work in archives, libraries, as an historian, meaning reading and analyzing historical sources. And on the other hand, analyzing these sources using methods offered by computer science. To take advantage of the richness of a liberation collection, one of the challenges was to read a significant portion of the nearly 1,000 works of fiction and personal narrative in the collection. Therefore, I have selected a little over 140 to have a more or less representative sample of these 1945 works. However, I still face a problem. How can I read 144 novels and memoirs? This is where digital humanities come into play. So let me remind you what I want to achieve is 3 main objectives. To create a corpus of digital text, to integrate it into the library's digital collection, and to analyze this corpus with a computer to answer in historical questions. So first, how to create a digital corpus? So I began by digitizing my research material. Next, after the documents were digitized, I move on to text extraction using what is called optical character recognition. You can forget that. And once the text is extracted, it is corrected and structured in a specific format, namely XML-TI. You can also forget that. Finally, I am able to apply computational tools to perform what we call textual analysis. I benefited from the assistance and expertise of Simon Gabet, a colleague from the University of Geneva, who applied his pipeline to extract text from the images and structure the resulting data in XML-TI. The pipeline is actually the result of a work originally focused on 17th century text, and it works pretty well on books published in the 40s. At this stage, we have conducted tests on a sample of 14 digitized books to identify issues, mistakes, errors, etc. So this is still very much a work in progress and far from finished. However, we have achieved already some results. First, here is an example of a book, namely Le Mousse de Concarneau by René Rennes. I'm from Brittany, this is why I chose this book. Structured in XML-TI. This format is widely used in the humanities community to exchange and analyze textual data. And it is also necessary to obtain data in XML-TI format so that the digitized corpus can be, in the future, accessed via the Cambridge Digital Library. This format, it's working, has an additional advantage. It allows the output to be transformed quite easily, for instance, by enabling the display of text in a simple web browser. No texts are currently available online, as we strictly adhere to copyright laws. What you see here, it is a prototype of what we can achieve, and can only be used on this laptop. So, yeah. On the textual analysis side, I am in the middle of texting and text testing. I'm doing tests. And I'm currently working on a few selected texts. For example, I have analyzed the novel Numéro 37 contre Gestapo by Vergex, published in 1946. I chose this novel because it develops a classic plot for a war novel. The story follows the adventure of an English officer named Dick Dinner, also known as number 37, who is parachuted into occupied France. He is headed by Mrs. Dastor and her niece Marie-Hélène, two French women who take enormous risks to hide and protect Numéro 37, number 37. I perform topic modeling and rolling emotion detection thanks to a fine-tuned camembert. BERT stands for Bidirectional Encoder Representation from Transformers. It is a deep learning model designed for natural language processing tasks like text classification, named entity recognition, or even emotion detection. Since we, the French, cannot live without cheese, we obviously name the model trained on French Camembert. So we just couldn't resist. Anyway, it gives the average emotion in each part of the text, arbitrarily divided into 20 sections. Two emotions dominate, joy and sadness. As you can see, joy is associated with the French command, but also with the help provided by the novel's two heroines. In other words, it's resistance and solidarity that comes first. Sadness, on the other hand, is, logically, associated with enemies, prisoners, death. Hitler's is also one of the subjects most associated with sadness. You see here what's simple of what we can do. And the idea is to apply the same treatment to the entire digitized corpus to better understand the typical features of resistance literature. What are the next steps? I first have a significant amount of archival work to do, both at the National Archives in France and in specialized archival centers dedicated to the history of publishing. Okay, sorry. On the digital side, first improving the OCR results, then applying on these results and first on a larger scale, the techniques I just presented to you, and also integrating the metadata from fiction and personal narrative into geohistory, a virtual research environment development. Here you have an example of what can be achieved with a database integrated into geohistory. And here you have a map. The idea is to do the same with the metadata of the Liberation Collection. So none of this would have been possible without the support of Sir Charles Chadwyck-Healey. I would also like to thank the collections and academic liaison of the Cambridge University Library, and especially Irene Tabri-Teranki. I also won't forget all the people from the Rare Books reading room who had to fetch and prepare more than 150 books for me. I would also like to thank Claire Hall for giving me shelter and food for 2 months. Thank you all for your attention. I will be happy to answer you if you contact me.